It's my pleasure to call, first of all, Dr. Alan Boesak, who together with the second witness, Mahmoud Hassan, will be giving testimony about the whole question of extrajudicial killings, torture, cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment and punishment, arbitrary arrest and illegal imprisonment during Apartheid South Africa and in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So, will Dr. Boesak please come forth? Thank you. And just to indicate our real pleasure, Dr. Boesak, that you've been able to come forward virtually at a moment's notice. Because unfortunately, Mrs. Winnie Madikizela Mandela could not attend. And really it says much about the fact that Dr. Boesak has always been available to come forward throughout his life to stand and give testimony and take action on behalf of the question of justice and freedom. So thanks very much. You now have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson. I will not respond by saying anything about a black preacher in time, and I will keep myself to the 10 minutes. I am deeply grateful and honored for the few minutes that I have, as the Chairperson said, to simply remind us of apartheid and what it meant and how it reflects itself today in the situation in Palestine. There is a sense, Chairperson, jury members, and ladies and gentlemen, in which it will, of course, never be possible to even begin to give a full account of what was called extrajudicial killings, death squads, murder, torture, detentions without trial, illegal imprisonment, right through the days of apartheid. My own personal involvement is for a very short period, between 1976 and the beginning of the 1990s, just before we had our negotiated settlement and our elections. It will never be possible, even though we have had in this country the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which dealt with all of these things. But even there, only a small fraction of the truth was ever meant to come out. They could not chase it all down. Terry Bell has co-authored a book with Advocate Benza in which they mentioned that just before the TRC, the South African government, the apartheid government, had destroyed some 44 metric tons of paper, that was all evidence as what was happening in those days. I can only speak of what I had experienced here and there, the death squads here in Cape Town, in Nyanga, in Gugulethu, in Crossroads, the thousands and thousands of young people who had been harassed and beaten up by police. And by the time of the first state of emergency in this country in the early 80s, there were no less than 30,000 people in detention, 40% of them children under 18 years old. And so I can talk about that. I can talk about the violence that we experience just about every single day. I can talk about the students who came back from detention and told me as their pastor in those days about the torture and about what they had gone through. I can talk about what the effect of all of that was on their families and on their lives. I can talk about discussions with activists from the 1980s whom I met after our democracy in 1994, who is still not just carrying the scars of their torture, but who were still burdening under the psychological weight of what they had gone through and how that had negatively impacted their lives. The point I want to make is that when we talk about torture and about killings and their effect on families and on people, remember, apartheid was a system that gave generational benefits to those who benefited from it. But the impact of torture and pain and suffering and deprivation and dispossession, that was also generational. And as you talk about what's happening in Palestine today, please keep that in mind. One of the things about the times of violence in South Africa was that every single time we discovered where it was possible, not just that people had been killed, but the manner in which they were killed. I buried in Cradock, the Cradock 4. And I remember the funeral of thousands of people, but what I remember most is the discussion with the families. And Mrs. Gonaway, who told me two things that I will never forget. One, she said how she could not look at her husband's body, but somebody had identified the body on the family's behalf, and they came back with a report. Something like, what, 65 stab wounds, stomachs cut open, throats cut, hair pulled out, dogs had bitten them. It was the manner in which that kind of inhumanity manifested itself that left the scars that are permanent. Nothing will ever erase them. And that is the point that we should always remember. It seems to me that the question is not a question that we have heard throughout the TRC hearings, for instance. How is it possible that someone could be so inhumane, that someone's humanity could be so totally lost, so completely gone? I don't think that's the main question. I think the main question is, what did that person think? Where did they get the power to do that to those who had become their victims? And it seems to me that is the power that creates a law that dispenses of all law, a power that makes it possible for arbitrary arrest and for imprisonment and for torture and to terrorize, and thereby to suspend all humanity. It's the power to create a climate in which all of this becomes first necessary, then understandable, then justifiable, then normal, and then legitimate. The question is whether what is going on in Palestine under Israeli occupation today, whether that could withstand the test of legitimacy, not whether it's understandable or justifiable, but whether it would stand the test of legitimacy in terms of the humanity and the human rights and the dignity of people. In South Africa after apartheid, during the TRC hearings, there is one thing that has bothered me, and let me read this. When the TRC held state officials criminally responsible, it was only for actions that would have been defined as crimes under apartheid law. It did not hold them accountable for the fact that those violence acts were authorized by apartheid law. When it did hold them accountable, it was for excess, for violence beyond the law. But by ignoring the violence authorized by apartheid and the inherent violence of apartheid laws, which in themselves, in their inherent brutality, could not but give rise to the inhumanities and brutalities of police and the army, they made a mistake. They did not question the rule of law identified with apartheid. I hope that in your work with Palestine and with Palestinians, you will not forget that. We also, in those days, you will now recall, used some sort of collective name for some of those who had come to symbolize the brutality of torture and killings in South Africa. We talk about the Google 807. We talk about the Cradock 4. We talk about the Uppington 20. For two reasons. One, they represented the communities where they came from, the communities they worked with and worked for, where they gave such courageous leadership and for whose freedom they suffered and died. But the other reason is they did not die as individuals and they were not killed as individuals. They were not killed by individuals. They were killed by the representative of a state that made it possible for such acts to happen and for people to actually be able to justify those acts of brutality and inhumanity. When we deal with this, I hope that you will also take that into account. When I visited Israel just for a week, I was stunned, I was almost disoriented by what I saw, and that I could identify so easily and recognize so easily what we have gone through. But in a certain sense, it went beyond what apartheid was doing. So apartheid and the Israeli state, the gratuitous violence, the dispossession of land, the oppression of people, the separation from democracy, from human flourishing, from justice, from economic freedom, from joy and hope, from the separation from belonging, the separation from a purpose in life except for the purpose the oppressor has in mind for you. That was all the same, but in the end, both had the same goal. It was a separation for the sake of extinction, of destruction, and of extermination. In my view, that is how we should judge this. What leads to the separation that brings extinction? What upholds the separation, not just the physical wall that brings dehumanization? What upholds and justifies the separation that brings extinction of people, that brings extermination of a culture and of the hopes of children? That is the question that I hope that you will also ask. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. You know, you get first prize for today in terms of brevity and the content you put into it. You were 10 minutes exactly. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
We'll spend, no clapping, please. This is not allowed. A few minutes, Dr. Boesak, for some questions. 3 max. And I'll turn to Yasmin Suka for the first question. Thanks, Yasmin.
One of the mistakes the South African Truth Commission made is that it didn't look, I think, sufficiently at the question of privilege and benefit. And you raise, I think, a second question, which is the intergenerational question of benefit and, of course, the impact of the structural violence on the generations that come after. And I wonder if you could expand on that in the context of apartheid, or what constitutes apartheid, and the similarity to Palestine.
Well, one of the things, ma'am, that is still a difficult question is because we did not identify properly, not so much the perpetrator as an individual and the victim as an individual. Professor Mamdani made that point over and over again, and I agree with him. But that we forgot that apartheid was part of a generational system of oppression that began with colonization, and that it was not really possible, neither for the government nor for the TRC, to draw a line in history and to say, we will take account from this date onwards, but what happened before cannot be pertinent because either we don't have the time to go into all of it, or it is too painful, or the results may be too much for the government to respond to. If you should talk about land restoration within the context of restitution, which is part of reconciliation, which was never really accepted or discussed, then you cannot say that the arbitrary line is 1936 or 1913. The line ought to be 1652. So we made those mistakes. And because we could not, or we did not want to grapple with a generational issue from the beginning in terms of all sorts of forms of oppression, we could not prepare for the generational issue after 1994. So now that you have young people who are still rich because their parents have built a platform of wealth through colonization and apartheid and exploitation, who will blandly say to you, this is not my responsibility, I never voted, I never even lived. as long as they enjoy the bank account that came from apartheid. And so that is the issue. And we don't have a proper way of dealing with it because the generational aspect of it has been neglected.
Thank you very much. One other question? Any members of the jury? Okay, I'll put the one final question for you. Thanks. The question of where ultimate responsibility lies, looking at the South African case, where the police officer, the army officer carrying out extrajudicial killings or torture and all the barbaric aspects that you've referred to, claim that they were only obeying orders and that actually the orders come from on high. What is your view in terms of responsibility in relation to this system and of the actual perpetrator?
Well, my view is that it is wrong to hold simply the foot soldier responsible for the orders that that foot soldier was given, even though one should make the caveat that personal responsibility overrides blind obedience in every certain sense. You have a conscience of your own, and you have to constantly ask the question whether what I do is right or wrong. But also, right through the TRC hearings, even from somebody like Dirk Coetzee, we had heard that they had simply followed orders. They got their orders from their military superiors. The military superiors got their orders in oblique ways sometimes from the politicians. The politicians created the climate in which these kinds of laws that I had just spoken about became the kind of law that created the framework within which people could act like that with impunity. But they never took responsibility. The politicians didn't want to take responsibility. The churches who preached that this was God's will did not take that responsibility. The businesses who created the climate in which apartheid was financed and from whom they in turn benefited never took responsibility. The media didn't want to take that responsibility. So if you ask the responsibility, my question would be, again, do not let us look at individual people who followed orders. Let us look at the composite of a culture, of a political system, of a political dispensation in all its different ways that creates a climate that provides justification almost a priori, and then gave people the right to do whatever they want because the humanity of the large chunk of their victims simply did not come. That responsibility is a human responsibility. Government cannot be absolved of that responsibility.
Thanks very much indeed,
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Boesak. Thank you.